Now, at the next stage, what happens is after they go through that forming stage, now how will you know that they're done with that forming stage? How will you know that they've progressed past it? What might you see at practice?
First fight.
Yeah, well, yeah, depending on what sort of sport you're in, but you might actually see the first fight, you might see the first argument, you might see players starting to do what? So Charity said that you define the rules and the standards and the behavioural expectations. When and once you define that, you actually find that players will start doing those things. Like they'll start conforming to what is important to the team, and they'll start honouring the team in that way. But in the storming stage, what starts happening is, yep, you see a few conflicts. What else? Do you ever see players starting to, like, let's say practice starts at 4 p.m. Now, up until a period in time when the team is forming, everyone's going, yeah, practice starts at 4 p.m. That means we're going to be a bit early. And then suddenly it just starts to, the time frame starts to, perhaps push out a little bit. And now practice is not just starting at 4 p.m. What time are players turning up? 4:05, 4:07, quarter past. Sorry about that. Running a bit late, no big deal. Anyone see that happen? Or perhaps they start talking to other players in maybe a bit of a disrespectful way. But basically they start pushing the boundaries of whatever standards you've initially set. So what do you do?
Clamp down.
That's where you got to clamp down. Okay, absolutely. That's why you got to enforce those boundaries and standards. Because what happens if you don't? What happens to your culture?
Lose control.
You absolutely lose control. Okay, and everything is symbolic. Turning up late is a symbol for what else? Disrespect. They could also be forgetting the gear. Who knows? They could be doing far worse things as well. Okay, but the point is, during the storming stage, players will push the boundary. So you've got to be onto that, which is important why you have to have boundaries in the first place. But they'll also start showing what we call their true colours. So we actually have an expression for this already. Now, from a DISC perspective, like when we look at the DIS and the C of the behavioural model, everyone is assigned a specific colour, whether they're a D, an I, an S, or a C. So literally, we already have an expression that people start showing their true self during the storming stage, and because of that, they start literally stepping on other players' toes and saying sometimes a bit of an offensive thing without thinking, etc., etc. And so you do start to get some arguments. Now, what if you're the style of coach who, in the initial stages of your team's development, in that forming stage, you're very good at being autocratic and directive, setting an agenda, setting a vision, creating a standard, talking about their goals. But what if you don't let go of that? So to the point where, because it's a fine line, like if you don't let your players, your athletes, take some responsibility for managing that conflict themselves and actually learning those skills, or perhaps you're the type of coach who's really conflict averse. And in terms of being a team, you're saying to the guys, or the ladies, whoever it may be, you're saying, look, we're a team, we're supposed to get along. Come on, put that stuff aside. So the point is, what if you don't let that conflict emerge? Because conflict is not a bad thing. Conflict is only a bad thing if it's poorly managed. And poorly managed means that you either way too strict and too hard and fast with your rules and standards, okay? Or you suppress it completely, thinking that harmony is far more important. What do you think? What would happen if you value harmony in that stage over everything else? Like you suppress that conflict.
It'll come back.
It'll come back when? Later. And the most usual time that it comes back later is when you start competing. So in a perfect world, pre-season, and as this progresses forward, we'd like to be at the norming stage, but we certainly want to be largely done with the storming stage by the time we start competing, right? Does that make sense? Because if you think that you have some little niggling issues during the practice phase of your preparation, the training, the pre-season, if you've got little issues then, what will those little issues become as the season really kicks in and you start competing in your conference tournaments? Do you ever notice that little issues just become big issues, especially when you pile a little bit of pressure and stress on? Okay, have you ever noticed that problems just don't go away? Like if it's a problem now, it will continue to be a problem most likely. And so we've got to encourage our athletes to deal with these things.